Okay. So can we start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. It's with tremendous pleasure that I welcome you to our first day of the 4-day online faculty development program organized by the Department of English of PSG College of Arts and Science, Coimbatore, Tamil Nadu. It's my duty to welcome our secretary, Dr. T. Kannayan, our principal, Dr. D. Brinda, and our vice principal, Dr. A. Anguraj. Without their support and guidance, this day would not have been possible. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Ampat Varghese Koshy, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Arts and Humanities, Zazan University, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Sometimes, as teachers and students of English literature, we might experience an existential crisis. Why literature? Why read literature? Why teach literature? In those times, it is good to remind ourselves that as long as humans exist, we will have uncertainties, conflicts. It was Claude Lévi-Strauss who said that humans started myth making to resolve the uncertainties of life. About 700 years ago, when the bubonic plague swept through Europe, much like our COVID times today, 10 young people quarantined together in a house narrated stories to kill time. They found hope and joy through stories. I'm talking about Boccaccio's Decameron. Now, as Black Lives Matter rages through America, African American literature, literary theory, post colonialism, race, and identity comes alive for us. So, literature and literary theory will continue to survive as a space to discuss human feelings, to discuss issues of identity and politics, to give us hope. It is not a death of a discipline, it is not a specter. With that through line, which threads through all the lectures in the coming days, I would like to declare the faculty development program open. I once again welcome all the literarians from all over the world. Now, over to Dr. Pavitra.
I can't hear Pavitra.
Good morning, everyone. Nothing matters but the writing. There has been nothing else worthwhile. A stain upon the silence. Samuel Beckett. I'm extremely happy to introduce today's resource person, Dr. Ampat Varghese Koshy, Assistant Professor in Department of English at the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, Yazan University, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Dr. Koshy is an accomplished writer with several published works to his credit. He has written, co written, and co edited many books of criticism, fiction, and poetry to his credit. He is a Pushcart Poetry Prize nominee for the year 2012 and four times Best Poem winner in Disney Poets UK ICOP 2013, 14, 18, and also 2019. He was also thrice featured in Camel Saloon's The Hump for the Best Poem and Best Editor's Pick. Even as a child, he won the Shankars International Award for writing at the age of 7. He is a reputed critic and also a well known reputed expert in the subject. To add credit to his feathers, he instituted the International Literary Prize in 2014 for writing, and he also runs an autism NPO with his wife Anna Gabriel. He is an author, editor, researcher, philanthropist, poet, critic, essayist who has published number of works whose list run long. His poems are translated into many Indian languages and other languages like Hindi, Urdu, Gujarati, Germany, Spanish, Arabic, even Tamil, Marathi, and Malayalam too. He recently achieved 10,000 reads on ResearchGate for his research articles and won a certificate from NanoGrimo USA 2018 and as well as one from Harvard X in Masterpieces in World Literature in the year 2019 with an A+. He also won Best Research and Academic in the year 2018 from Dazen University. He won World Bank's Urgent Work and participated in European Union's Edgar's. His latest books are Allusions to Simplicity and Birds of Different Feathers. He is working on 10 to 15 books now and being one Bob Dylan. His literary works have been agents of social change and also ignited a fire in every heart that dares to dream. Today, we are extremely happy and privileged to have an opportunity to listen to Dr. Koshy and wish everyone will carry back wonderful memories with them. Handing over the session to Dr. Koshy. Sir, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'm very happy to be introduced with that quotation from Samuel Beckett because I did research on Samuel Beckett and I have a book on him. And it's a very good quote to start with because I also start there. That is with the definition of literature. Our topic today is recent trends in literary theory and how to connect them to literary research. So I should start with some broad definitions of literature, literary criticism, theory, and research. So literature in the context of this talk can be seen now as writing that has some value, enough value to be read, researched on, referred to, quoted, and used, and to have theory applied on or to it due to its depth or relevance or topicality, contemporaneousness, or context or frame or background. But I don't want to stop with just that. Literature is language based, word based, logocentric, and also deals with phoneme and grapheme, not to mention morphemes. So that is another way of defining it, linking it with linguistics. A third way to say it is in some way a superior form of writing, fine writing, as opposed to more mundane or superficial or practical uses of writing. The last way is to say it is creative and imaginative. I used the word depth in my first sentence, and by this I mean it is not just about one thing but many things, such as history, philosophy, psychology, politics, economics, anthropology, and other disciplines in its content, which is what makes it slightly, if not quite, different from writing in those other disciplines in the 21st century. And what I mean to say is, in between I'll be explaining some things. Now, for example, if you write on philosophy, you will deal purely with philosophy, but in literature, you deal with all these topics. So it's different from writing in those disciplines. In the 21st century, this inter or multi or transdisciplinary nature of literature is something that it had once, as Dr. Bharati was saying, when dealing with myth, and has now recovered, whereas in between, it had narrowed its focus, perhaps, to only human-centered or anthropocentric writing. Literary criticism, from literature I'm going on to literary criticism. My talk has 4 parts. There's an introduction on literature, literary criticism, and research, and then I deal with eco-criticism, and then I deal with ethnic studies, and after that I deal with a kind of summing up of the latest trends. Plus, I also deal with trauma literature studies. The summing up comes last. So to come back to literary criticism. Literary criticism is no longer something distinguishable from literature, but can roughly be defined as meta-literature of a lengthy and descriptive kind or writing on or about literature, and literary theory can be defined as theory on literature and criticism on it. This is to start with, but now of course it is much more complex as it has become linked to ideology, psychology, and everything else. And thus, from Marxist criticism onwards, it becomes a battlefield or contest in reading or viewing or linking together concepts to set certain historical injustices or wrongs right by pointing them out or uncovering them or recreating a new lineage or lineage, and things like that in the case of feminism, post-colonialism, cultural studies, and even eco-criticism. The other stream of literary criticism is form-oriented. So here I want to explain a bit. Literary criticism, as far as I look at it, especially in the 20th century and 21st centuries, it flows in two streams. One is form-oriented and one is content-oriented. So the form-oriented stream consists of new criticism, formalism, structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, and postmodernism. And it goes on to very new things like accelerationism. The content-oriented ones are the ones I told you: Marxist criticism, feminism, post-colonialism, cultural studies, and even eco-criticism. In between these two schools are many schools of criticism which could belong to both, like hermeneutics, semiotics, archetypal criticism, new historicism, psychoanalytical criticism. You can bend them either way into form-oriented studies or content-oriented studies. Reader response theory also. Of course, the seeds of all this start much earlier, as how culture studies or cultural studies starts with Arnold, who wrote on culture, Eliot, who wrote on culture, Raymond Williams, who wrote on culture, etc. And aesthetics, that starts with Plato and Aristotle, or with the Resa theory in India, or poetics with Aristotle, Horace, Longinus, Sidney, etc. This is to go backwards. But now we come to modernity, and I wanted to talk about recent trends. And by recent trends, what I mean by recent trends is this. I'll explain that. When I completed my research, the year was 1994. So in the first week of 1994, I handed in my thesis. And at that time, the last contender for the throne of recent literary theory in texts that I studied then, the latest of which had been by Peter Barry, and the earlier ones being by people like Terry Eagleton and Jonathan Culler. Yeah, in those texts, the most recent trend was eco-criticism. So I would like to start from there. But you must remember that this was 26 years ago or 30 years ago. And so for me, I start with eco-criticism when I start off recent trends in literary criticism. Eco-criticism, which emerged in the 90s, was first something that dealt with nature and its study in literature, and thus referred back for students of English literature like me to someone like John Ruskin with Sesame and Lilies, and the romantics like Wordsworth, Prelude, lines written about Intern Abbey, Solitary Reaper, or I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and Coleridge with the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, of course, Keats' Ode to Autumn, Byron, The Ocean, but the breakthrough book was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. In a parallel dimension, some of us were also reading Francis Fukuyama's One Straw Revolution, which was connected. Later came someone from Norway, like Arne Naes, with his concept of deep ecology in his book Life Philosophy or Live Philosophy. So, eco-criticism, broadly speaking, is the study of, quotation marks begins, the representation of literature in the non-human world, of the non-human world, largely from the perspective of anxieties around humanity's destructive impact on the planet. Spearheaded by the work of Cheryl Glotfelty in USA and Jonathan Bate in the UK during the 1990s, the movement was motivated by a desire to speak for the natural world in the face of the linguistic turn in literary theory, which suggested that there was nothing outside the text. This is in deconstruction. While early eco-critics did not necessarily dismiss the notion that nature was a construct, they saw a vital need to reinstate the referent to engage with the physical world around them, which the activities of the human race were increasingly putting at risk. As the British philosopher Kate Soper memorably commented in her book, What is Nature? It is not language that has a hole in it, but the ozone layer. So, you know that from the time of Saussurean linguistics, we can divide how to study a text into studying it as a signifier with a signified, with a number of significations, with a referent, which is the world and everything in it. And now the thing is with Derrida or deconstruction, we came to a world where he said there's only a chain of signifiers. There are no significations. There are no reference. There's no world the text refers to. So this was a tricky situation, and in that tricky situation, eco-criticism, Marxist criticism, etc., came to say, but this does not help us to deal with human social concerns and problems. For example, the study of class, and feminism spoke about the study of gender inequalities or iniquities, and eco-criticism spoke about the difference between how man treats nature and man treats himself, the inequality and the lack of equity there. So I'm taking this quote that I just said from Timo Müller and Michael Sauter from Literature, Ecology, Ethics, Recent Trends in Eco-Criticism. Eco-criticism soon turned naturally to hybridity. I mean by hybridity here, I mean not only what Homi Bhabha means about a purity and impurity, but what I mean is it became interdisciplinary in studying the human nature connection, in going beyond American transcendentalism, best represented for eco-criticism by a writer like Thoreau in Walden. So it turned to the past to make connections in linking it with spirituality, for example, to become eco-spirituality, seeking validation in ancient Native American texts, in fertility rites, in earlier myths and scriptures of the world, in Finland and Norway, in India and Europe, and even in traditions like animism and tribalism, ending in theories like Gaia or the earth as she and mother, Bhumi Devi. And another hybrid was ecofeminism, where the connection is seen between woman as oppressed by man and nature, that is essentially feminine, as oppressed by human beings in a new light, as two sides of the same coin. At the same time, surprisingly, eco-criticism in South India found an ally in Dravidian aesthetics, which is what I would like to look at as an example of how eco-criticism can be applied, because I am honored to get this invitation from Coimbatore. So here I am dealing with the hybrid of eco-aesthetics. That means I am entering a field of mixing together ecology, environmentalism, sociology, and philosophy when I speak of aesthetics. A hybrid of a political or ideological theory and philosophy, as aesthetics is a branch of philosophy in the Western view. Since the advent of eco-criticism, Dravidian aesthetics has swum more into focus as important as an aesthetics derived from one's geography. While I would love to go into the details of the significant concept of Thinai, you all know about Thinai. Here again I am forced to distill the matter into what is absolutely important. I will define Thinai very simply as a very powerful meta narrative, a grand narrative which is all inclusive. It's a matrix, it's a nexus. A parallel Greek word is oikos. Uh, uh, the fact is, no poetry or literature can be written apart from its references to specific spaces, places, and times to make sense, or the order around it of natural or artificial, that is, landscape and architecture, socio-cultural and politico-economic or religious and spiritual elements, not to mention human agency or action. But the exciting part of Thinai for me is, this complete system of looking at poetry, of looking at literature was codified so many years back, very exactly, and its flexibility by which it can be applied to any writing anywhere, especially the subcontext, sorry, especially the sub-concepts of aham, agam, that is inside, the subjective narration of family or man-woman love or relationships, and puram, agam and puram, the view from outside, social, more objective, and of mudal porul, which is a principle of first thing, and the setting of time and season, the polutha or place, the nilam, the ground of being, to put it in philosophical terms, and Kairupural, the element of the landscape and the culture, and finally Puripural, that is human action, or the substance or essence of the work. Some people connect Tinai to words like oikos or nexus or matrix, and some to the landscape alone faultily. But it's a greater concept and highly advanced for the age the Sangam one. It came from in Tamil Nadu. It shows beautiful poetry of the greatest intensity was written in India in the south in an intertwining with this understanding, where it is really not possible for me to any longer tell if theory drove the writing or writing drove the theory. The exciting thing about this was that once I was reading an essay on American poetry and came across this curious and interesting delineation of it based on whether the poets were coastal, meaning from near the sea, or from the interior, that is, landlocked places. Frost is a typical example, Robert Frost, of a primarily landlocked poet, while the lyricist Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, and the Beach Boys themselves, the band, would obviously be the former, with a song like Surfing USA. I speak more of content, not necessarily of where they come from. So what interested me was, many studies that are being done connecting eco-criticism and Thinai are being done on Indian works, but not many are being done driving theory from the east to the west, whereby you can take this theory and apply it to texts in the west. So I have done one such study, which I am going to briefly introduce now. The 5 regions delineated in the concept of Thinai, are Kurinji, hilly or mountain region, Palay, patched and dry lands, Mullai, pastoral tract, Marutham, wet or agricultural lands, and Nathal, or coastal area. Uh, if we go to the west, of course, they may have difficulties with the words Kurinye and Mulle and Pale, but if you give them the translation, they will be easily able to understand. And these types exist in the West also. So what happens if we posit a study of a famous Robert Frost poem in eco-critical and Dravidian aesthetics or Thinai terms? I found a poem like Mending Wall or Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening or Birches. All these poems fit perfectly for an eco-critical study in terms of Dravidian aesthetics, in terms of studying it in terms of Thinai. And so I have taken Mending Wall. I've taken Mending Wall, and you know about Mending Wall. I'm not going to read it because I don't have much time. But basically, it's about two neighbors who come together in springtime to repair the wall between them. And Frost asks a question: why does this wall get destroyed every year? Seemingly by no one. And he tells us indirectly that it is destroyed by nature because nature doesn't love walls. And at the end he says, uh, but my neighbor says, good fences make good neighbors. And so he and we build the wall together every year, although these questions go through my mind. Now, why did I take this poem? Why did I take this poem? I took it for a reason. The poem is obviously eco-critical. It speaks of maintaining the ecology and the ecosystem and the environment. And it also speaks of destructive elements that militate against the peace of the same, namely the neighbor, the fence itself, the hunters, the yelping trained hunting dogs, or cows that may cross over and eat the neighbor's fruits. But what interests me is the ease with which it lends itself to a Dravidian aesthetics analysis. So I will talk of it briefly because you'll find it very interesting. Now my talk will become interesting to you. First off, it is a Puram poem, because it deals with the outside. It brings in the relationship between man and man, or it's a social poem, you can say. It is not an agam poem. The season is spring, and the time of day, or the polutha, and the land or the space or the place, the nilam, is all given. It's daytime, it's domestic, it's farmland, it's agricultural. The mudal porul, the principal thing or setting, is thus easy to discover. Yeah, it's farmland, it's agricultural land, and it's also a domestic setting. They are neighbors. So is the Kariporul, the American landscape of the interior, where farming is the main occupation, near forest and pasture. Yeah, so implicitly, there is a clash between the Old Testament eye for eye and the New Testament who is your neighbor question. Eye for eye shown by stones and guns, and the other question raised by Frost himself. So what is a human action or Uriporul? The human action is this question that is raised from the Gospels by Frost, who is asking who is a good neighbor. So Frost is not, as people think, as free of religious or mythical concerns as he is made out to be after all. It's surprising. The poem, by describing both man and his culture in the landscape, is very Thinai centered and beautifully alive also to socio-cultural, politico-economic, and natural or landscape architectural nuances, as well as spiritual and religious ones. Even the title is helpful in its paradoxical nature, Mending Wall, as is the reference to elves. He mentions elves in it, and this brings in folklore because this is folkloric tradition to refer to elves, and this is also in a way very Indic or Indological or Indian. Does Frost match Thinai poets of the Sangam age? To tell you the truth, for one coming from the geography of South India, for whom that geography is there in his or her blood, nothing matches the beauty of Sangam poetry because it speaks to him or her of what is in his very blood, the places and spaces and times and seasons of one's growing up, of family life, of local man-woman relationships, of social and cultural complexities and hegemonies and hierarchies, thus coming from the soil, so to speak. But it is the same power in Frost. So much of the sense of belongingness or oneness or being at ease with his environment and ecology is there in his poems, and also in poems like Birches and Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, that it makes them worth reading for us Indians. Eco criticism is thus. So, what I want to say is, we can do many studies like this by using Indian aesthetics to study Western texts. And that's a very powerful area of research for literature students. So, eco criticism is thus culturally determined to a large extent, and the frames and context used for this reading will be likewise dependent on the reader. Yet I also need to briefly mention material eco-criticism, which deconstructs the Marxist idea of materialism surprisingly by giving matter agency and bringing in biosemiotics, post-colonial ecofeminisms, and notions of the literary and the ethics of reading, bringing it back to connect it with what it started out as, which is a questioning of deconstruction and the notion that there is nothing outside the text. Eco-criticism has naturally also led to inquiry into biopolitics, which ties it to works of thinkers like Foucault, and to me, much more relevantly, a thinker like Giorgio Agamben, or Judith Butler, or even Zizek. This talk of eco-criticism, eco-spirituality, eco-feminism, and eco-aesthetics brings us into the 90s. But what happens in literary theory after that? What happens in literary theory after that? There are more hybrids. There is eco-Gothic, for example, where eco-criticism and Gothic novels are being studied. And ecology, eco-criticism and science fiction, eco-criticism and thrillers. It's going on. As I said earlier, literary theory from the time of Marxist criticism turned to a reformation mode, which pointed out imbalances in history. And following on in that line or mode of inquiry came about the School of Ethnic Studies, which has also found its echo in India. Ethnic studies, which is sometimes called minority studies. And in the beginning, Dr. Bharati was talking about Black Lives Matter. And that's where ethnic studies, which stems from identity politics, comes into the picture. What is ethnic studies? In the critical and interdisciplinary study of race, ethnicity, and indigeneity, with a focus on the experiences and perspectives of people and color within and beyond the United States, since the emergence of ethnic studies as an academic field in the late 1960s, scholars have analyzed the ways in which race and racism have been and continue to be powerful social, cultural, and political forces, and their connection to other axes of stratification, including gender, class, sexuality, and legal status. It utilizes a range of humanities and social science methodologies to analyze the production and effects of race and indigeneity. You can focus on one racial group or study comparatively and transnationally. Collectively, this kind of research and teaching provide a comparative framework for understanding particular racialized and indigenous groups as well as the relationships among them. Yeah, now we come to a part of ethnic studies or a crossover or a hybrid. So ethnic studies in America now also deals with Asian American, Asian diaspora studies, of which a branch is Indian diaspora studies, Chicana or Chicano studies, Latina or Latino studies, Native American studies, and there's Native Canadian Indigenous Tribal studies going on in Canada. Comparative ethnic studies. Now, if you go to Berkeley, University of Berkeley, which is a university I respect because it's an Ivy League university, they have an entire program, and I've taken the description from, Berkeley's website. But how do I come to ethnic studies? So while teaching The Pearl by John Steinbeck, while doing an anthology called the Significant Anthology, which I was the editor of, along with two others, Reena Prasad and Michelle Barron from USA, which had 176 writers from all over the world, I came across a writer called Elizabeth Marino. She was a Puerto Rican, and she sent me a collection of poems, and I became aware of the gaps and disparities, and how someone who's in the minority in a country looks at the dominant discourse, the discourse of the majority, or the discourse of those who have power. And recently reading a story on the Rwandan genocide, I understand more and more the importance of ethnic studies. Even in MA, and before, I had read books like Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, Richard Wright's Native Son, Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, Alice Walker, who brought in womanism, which is very important, because she said American feminism is for white women, black women need a different kind of feminism. Maya Angelou, etc. So theories, this theory that connects race, women, and literature, it was available to me, and studies on Black American or African American literature, came into focus more. In India, we speak of Jhumpa Lahiri, Rohinton Mistry, Salman Rushdie with the ground beneath her feet, etc. Yeah. So how does this work in India? How has it come into India? Now, when we speak of India, it has found an echo, primarily in Dalit literature and studies on it. Here two hybrids come into play. For example, recently I was correcting a thesis, and that deals with the novels of U.R. Anandamurthy, and it has been studied from a Dalit feminist viewpoint. It's very interesting. So here too, hybrids come into play, as in, for instance, Dalit feminism, which is different from Indian hegemony-ridden feminism, in being more specific in its analysis of double consciousness, to use a phrase by W.E.B. Du Bois, the black Afro-American thinker. So to briefly show you the example of the scope of ethnic studies, let me take a poem by Namdeo Dasal. Again, I am not going to read the poem, but I'll tell you the name, who is acknowledged by many to be the greatest Dalit poet in India by many, and try to show you a little bit on how it is an Indian version of ethnic studies. So the poem I have chosen is from Golpita, his collection. It's translated by Dilip Chitre, and it was in 1972. And it's called Ask Fucker Spark 1. It's the first it has a follow-on poem. And again, I don't have time to read it, but I want to read one section so you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. Yeah. I bear a crown of agony on my head, a luminous fountain of African anguish. A wound has found its home in my heart. Even words cannot open its doors. No complaint can be registered here. A wretched derelict of a poet like me, there are neither slogans nor shrieks of pain. Every face of compassion wears a black veil. You are allowing your downtrodden life to swim in the hell water of self-alienation. What more can the trees do now except scratch the armpits of bygone times? Let me fill into my eyes the darkness in the womb of the soil. You know, Namdeo Dasal started as a parallel to the Black Panthers movement in India. Um, the Dalit Panthers in Maharashtra. He comes from the Mahar community, and he uh, paradoxically, by the end of his life, he joined the Shiva Sena. But what I want to say is, this poem, you should read it. You should read it. It's worth reading. All his poems are worth reading. It's a great poet. This poem, that's a monologue by an I who finds an uncrossable gulf between him and the you in the poem. One that seems to have existed forever and never be bridged, is an excellent example of one in which ethnic studies analysis can be done due to its images that can only be used by one well versed in the community that Dasal comes from. You know, his forefathers dealt in selling the skins of dead animals. Dalit literature starts with one of its foundations being that English is an aid to upward social mobility. But there are other important points that are swimming to the surface recently. One is that Dalit literature, which is a parallel in foregrounding caste studies as ethnic studies started out by foregrounding race studies, on the inequality and lack of equity that existed between whites and blacks, but expanded to examining also the treatment of the oppressive race of Native Americans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, etc., Asians of both racial origins, but soon went beyond the white man telling the story. Similarly, Dalits are now telling their own story, starting with writers like Dasal to the latest much talked of writer Yogesh Maitreya with his book Flowers on the Grave of Caste. And they, on their way, refer back to thinkers like Ambedkar, Kancha Ilaya, and Chandraban Prasad. Their canon includes books or essays like Annihilation of Caste by Ambedkar, Kancha Ilaya's Why I Am Not a Hindu, Buffalo Nationalism, or Defying the Odds, The Rise of Dalit Entrepreneurs by Chandraban Prasad. And they have their own icons in Kanshiram, Tanda Periyar, Ayyankali, Poigail Yohanan, Rohit Vemula, and of course Jyotirao and Savitribai Phule. This is the most original strand definitely of ethnic studies in India now, and worth pursuing, as shown even now by the heated debate going on about Yogesh Maitreya's article. My English isn't broken, your English is Brahmin. A central claim. Now I come to the third stream, which I want to deal with, and then I'll give you the summary, I'll give you the names. The third stream is contemporary literary trauma theory. And this, again, it starts with psychoanalysis, naturally, of Freud, carried on by Jung and Lacan and others, Melanie Klein, etc. And but the first literary text that people started dealing with in the realm of trauma studies, they were the war poets. The war poets. Now, the war poets, when they came into touch with what was happening to them in the First World War and Second World War, etc., naturally they went into trauma, and they wrote poems about it. Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owens, Keith Douglas in the Second World War, and many other poets. But what is interesting is now when we speak of literary trauma theory, we go forward again. We go forward. For example, what do we go forward into? Trauma literature. It needn't be any longer about war and about large events like COVID, but it could also be, for example, about a defining feature. It's a transformation of the self ignited by an external, often terrifying experience, which illuminates the process of coming to terms with the dynamics of memory that inform the new perceptions of the self and the world. The external event that elicits an extreme response from the protagonist is not now necessarily a natural disaster as a tsunami or the COVID pandemic or a collective human experience like war. The event may include the intimately personal experience of experiencing sexual violence as a female. Now, this interests me very much because this opens up the studies. It opens up. So, you don't just take pandemic studies as writing done during the COVID were a general disaster and its impact on people. But you can also take personal and intimate tragedies and its effect on individuals for study. So, looking at the predecessors, you know, um, looking at the predecessors, I came across, two predecessors that I want to talk of. One is the story of Ahalya in India. You know the story. Ahalya was a pure and chaste wife, and Indra came to her one day, disguised as her husband, and slept with her. And her husband found out and evicted her from the house, and she became a stone. She was turned into a stone, it says. Now, this is typical of trauma. Okay, in trauma, what happens is the protagonist cannot verbalize what happened to her. Protagonist or him, the protagonist is silenced. We have an example of Sita saying, Mother Earth swallow me, Bhumi Devi swallow me. That's eco-critical, but that's also trauma because she silences herself. She doesn't know what to do in the Agni Pariksha. And the same thing is there if you look in Ovid, Metamorphosis, the stories of Grecian mythology. So I've taken this poem by Yeats. I'm running out of time, but the poem is Leda and the Swan. And I will just read the first and last paragraph and go on to my conclusions. And about other theories, I will just mention. You can do your own research. So, Leda and the Swan. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. The last answer. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? So Yeats asks the question, what did Leda get out of being raped by Apollo, the god coming in the form of a swan? We see here both the absence of knowledge on the part of the poet himself on what trauma means, as it ends with a question. The poet not knowing how to verbalize what Leda might have felt, and also the silence spoken of in trauma literature study, where the victim of trauma is silenced and silenced, unable to give vent in words to the trauma itself. To look back at literature now in the light of such a theory is to get much insight on patriarchy, for example, and its cruelty as well in myth and history. So again, we come to the idea of hybrids. Now I am completing. So, I gave an introduction where I started from the beginning of literary criticism and brought you up to the 1990s. Then I told you about eco-criticism, eco-spirituality, eco-feminism, eco-gothic, with an example in Tamil literature, Dravidian aesthetics of Thinai applied on a poem by Robert Frost. And then I spoke about ethnic studies, and I spoke about Black African American literature especially, and other examples like Puerto Rican. And there I spoke about Dalit literature and Dalit feminism in connection with it. And I dealt with a poem by Namdeo Dasal, and how I apply ethnic studies and minority studies in Dalit literature, caste studies, about the clash between minority culture and dominant culture there. And then I told you about contemporary literary trauma studies. And I took a poem by Yeats, Leda and the Swan, and I've told you how to look at it. Not fully, because you have to apply Freud, you have to apply Lacan, and you have to apply this gap between the fact that it is not the victim who speaks, but someone speaks for the victim. And how authentic can the voice of that person who speaks for the victim be under such conditions? If the victim is a woman and the speaker is a man, for example. So it's a very interesting field of study. And in all these fields of study, and now I will complete. But what I want to tell you is there are more recent trends like affect theory. Please jot this down if you are listening to me, because I don't have the time. I have to end now. But there is affect theory, which is very important. There is disability studies. Disability studies. This is extremely important for me because I have a son who has autism. And it's important for everyone to, and I disagree with the name itself, because I think it should be called studies on different kinds of ability. But still, at least America started in the 60s something called disability studies. So affect theory, disability studies, and disability studies can be connected to the new studies coming up on illness and disease and mental health due to issues like COVID-19 and the suicide of Sushant Singh Rajput. And while I was talking of Leda and the Swan, rape literature that deals with accounts of narratives of rape. And I want to tell you that a book, an anthology in which my poems appear, was produced called Muffled Moans by Santosh Bakaya and Loba Banerjee, which is called Muffled Moans, which deals with this whole trauma in literature, which is a very fertile field of study. And minority studies can include Islamic studies. It can in India. It can include studies on Christianity in India. It can include studies on Tamil Brahmins in India, because Tamil Brahmins are only 2% in population in India, and Christians are only 2% in population in India. But it should concentrate on Dalit studies. I mean, this is my opinion. Now, for those interested, now please understand there are recent trends of development in cultural studies. There are recent trends of development in post-cultural studies between Francophone and Anglophone, in cultural studies between media analysis and popular culture and high culture. I mean, there are so many developments. So, in post-colonial studies, and there are also there are genre studies. Genre studies means studies on science fiction, studies on fantasy, studies on thrillers, and studies on islands. Recently, I came across a wonderful seminar where they were studying island literature, starting with Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, and going on to Swiss Family Robinson and William Goldfield, William Golding's, Lord of the Flies, literature written on and around islands, and then going on to real sociological studies. So, minority studies I spoke about. Then there is queer theory, LGBTQIA, gender theory, identity politics, and now it is not just LGBT, it is LGBTQIA, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer, intersexual, and asexual studies. So that has also got tremendous scope. Yeah, with this I hope to end. And if you want a book, you have to look up. There's a book by Robert Dale Parker called How to Analyze Literature. And, in the last chapter, it talks about disability studies. And it talks about, this is why I would like you to look up the last chapter. And, there is an affect theory reader by Melissa Gregg and Gregory J. Seaworth. I'm sorry because it's 1 hour is not enough. And I've taken maybe 1 hour or more. But I'm really sorry because this is so vast. But I hope I've given you a very good overall idea about recent trends in literary theory, how you can apply them to some select texts. I've given you examples from poetry and how I applied them. I've given you some references. And finally, when you do research, what matters is not showing off or dropping names. Yeah, the last thing I want to talk about is, European graduate studies. There's a thinker called Benjamin Bratton. And Benjamin Bratton interests me because he deals with design, with digitality, with technology, with synthetic ecosystems, and evolving ecosystems. That means smart city, for example, is a synthetic, ecosystem, and um, uh, synthetic biology, where artificial intelligence comes in. Synthetic biology, where artificial intelligence comes in. Yeah, so I have given you a rough bird's eye view. This is all I can do in so much time. I hope you're happy, and maybe we could have more interactions in the future, where I could go more into depth on the things I only skimmed over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. We are extremely happy to have you here on this wonderful day. Had a wonderful session. I hope every participant on the stage would have enjoyed listening to you. And now I would like to put forth one of the questions that the participants have asked you, sir. Can I, sir, please?
Yeah, sure. We
Pavitra,
have
if
time.
you excuse me, can I? Sir, thank you for being so informative. I mean, we had lots to take, and I'm sure that all the participants would have had something to take from here. Before the participants' questions are posed, I have a question. Sir, how
Okay.
can theories be applied to short stories? Is it possible? How effective it would be?
Yeah, ma'am, of course. We can apply theory to short stories, novel, poetry, non-fiction, autobiography, travelogue, anything. There is a talk by Chim Amanda Adichie, who's now very famous in Africa and USA, where she quotes from a writer called John Locke, who's not at all a famous writer. But the point I want to make is that you can use any text if you use it in a sensible manner. So definitely you can do research on short stories. Let's take, for example, eco Gothic, which is a new field. Now, there's a story by young Goodman Brown called Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I think that that would be a very good example of how short story, if you want to do a paper on the eco Gothic, you can take a story like Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and you can link the two easily. So it depends on your knowledge and ability to do the right kind of linkages. I hope that explains the question.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
And the answer. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Pavitra? Dr. Pavitra?
Ma'am, yes, ma'am, I'm here, ma'am. I'm here. So we have a question from a person called Keetana Ganesan. Her question is, can we do an ethnic study on Nigerian literature, particularly on Igbo society?
Yes, of course we can. Of course we can do it. But there are, first off, when we do research, as you all know, you also have to think of what your limitations are. That's a section in a research proposal. And the other thing is, in this case, personal, this is just a personal opinion, okay? You don't have to follow this. I would suggest that if you want to do on Nigerian literature and Igbo culture, which is connected to Chinua Achebe, who has already been a pioneer in this field with a work like Things Fall Apart, and his other books, Anthills of the Savannah, etc., etc. Now, the thing is, the limitation is, unless you go there, you don't have any field data. Unless you go there, you meet the Igbos or you meet Chinua Achebe, you about in Nigeria, you don't have field data. So you're working to some extent in the dark. And to make up for that, you can try to draw a parallel with a similar culture in India. You can make it a comparative ethnic study, which is very much a part of ethnic studies and minority studies and tribal studies, etc.
Thank you, sir. We have one more question. Which theory can be applied to the poem Hyperion by Keats?
Um, Hyperion. See, when you talk about applying theory to a poem, you have to understand that any theory can be applied to any poem, provided you really know that theory well enough. When you talk about Keats in particular, but when you speak of something like Hyperion, which is different from Isabel and the Pot of Basil, or which is different from Eve of Saint Agnes, I think that you a place, a safe place. I am suggesting this without knowing who the person I am talking to is. A safe place to start is New Historicism, which tells you to start with the text, the biography of the writer, and the historical context, and to look at it from the historical context in which you are. This is a very safe point to start from. So, although this may sound offbeat to some people, because I know the work of New Historicism and of Stephen Cranblatt and others, I'm telling you that if you want to study any text, uh, instead of immediately going into culture studies, Hyperion can be studied in terms of archetypal criticism. Hyperion can be studied in terms of culture studies, about the disparity between Englishmen and their culture and how they were looking back to cultures of the past, for inspiration. Hyperion can be studied in many ways, but my point is, as a starting point, you could start by looking at how you can connect it to the biography of the writer, the history of the writer, and your own biography and your own history, and also do textual analysis.
Thank you so much, sir. One final question, sir. Uh,
Yeah.
the person named M. Haiku has asked, can disability study, the special physical study, show another mode for trauma literature?
For trauma literature.
Trauma literature.
Definitely, definitely. You see, disability studies, came because, the first seminal work in the 60s was written by a person who, at that time, this was a term used by everyone. Okay, disabled. The first book that came was written by a disabled person who was articulate. Now, how do you link it to trauma? You link it to trauma in a very simple way. For example, my son has autism, but my son, is non-verbal. He can speak very few words, very few sentences. Now, his trauma cannot be articulated in a work of literature, except by someone like, if I am a writer, so I could try to articulate his work in my poems and stories. I do also, and many others are doing things like that. There's a very famous novel, about a dog, which is considered, but much more. Uh, there's a lady who has autism who's very articulate, who writes books. But trauma, as I said, deals with things not from the point of view of the victim, or seldom from the point of view of the victim, and even if it's from the point of the view of the victim, it comes afterwards. So it has certain problems, that some things may be forgotten, some things may be slurred, some things may be hidden out of fear, some things, so there are a lot of narratological problems there, and I didn't deal with narratology. But definitely disability studies and trauma studies, I would not even say they're closely related. I could say that in some senses they are one. We have to link them together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. We are so much
Yeah.
pleased to have you on this day. I would like to again start with a quote by Emerson. Cultivate the habit of being grateful for every good thing that comes to you and to give thanks continuously.
And because all things have contributed to your advancement, you should include all things in your gratitude. Sir, we are really grateful to you for your overwhelming knowledge on the subject literature. We are profound and happy to thank you, sir. And we also thank you, sir, for sharing your expertise. I'm extremely happy to recall the famous lines from renowned poets, particularly from Robert Frost, good fences make good neighbors from Mending Wall. I feel so nostalgic hearing to these lines. Extraordinary examples and the combination of Aham and Puram is explicit, sir. It is a honor to have you as one of our resource speakers. Right from literary criticism, eco criticism, Gothic literature, Dravidian aesthetics, ethnic studies, Black African American literature, and how to apply ethnic studies and how contemporary literary trauma study will help us in near future researches and also studies on different kinds of abilities and recent studies in literature. Sir, we are so thankful to you, and I was so impressed with the story of Ahelia, recalling the story of Ahelia also. And we are happy to know more about contemporary trauma theory and your point on how disability study should be taken in the other stand. I also take this platform to thank our management, principal, vice principals, and everyone who stood aside us and supported us to make this session a wonderful success. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
May I
Thank you,
leave
sir.
now?
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sir,
Sir,
thank
we would
you
like to contact you in future also to guide us over things.
so much.
Thank
I
you
learned
very much.
today, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank you
sir.
very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you, participants.
Yeah.
Ma'am.
Shivram, live streaming can be stopped now.